Regarding the project background, it's a project that stemmed from the realization that migration and mobility are an ongoing and social transformatory dynamic that has increased worldwide, as we probably all know, but that is particularly affecting South Africa, whether internally as a result of urbanization and internationally as a result of a number of factors, one of which being South Africa having become an economic hub in the region. The other the second important dimension in the study was the developmental role ascribed to local government from the existing policy framework in the constitution, the white paper, the existing legislation, but also the tension between this developmental role and the fact that migration and mobility seriously complicate this role, essentially in connection with the uncertainties associated with migration. So our objectives in conducting this study were threefold. First of all, we were interested in providing a nationwide overview of migration patterns at the municipal level. Second, to determine the role that municipalities and other stakeholders, including national and provincial governments, can and should play in relation with mobility. And finally, to assess through a qualitative study the existing capacity and the kind of information and financial support that municipalities need in addressing migration. At the micro-local scale, at the micro-local level, we all know how this translates, and this is actually the challenge that municipalities are faced with. And this is a slide that has been kindly borrowed from the city of Johannesburg, showing aerial photographs between 2000 and 2009 of Diepsloot Extension 1, and very clearly showing you the concentration, the multiplication of dwellings, and the kind of governance challenges that this may pose to policymakers. The number one key finding for us was that there's very uneven and irregular relationship with data among city managers, people in charge of planning departments within municipalities, very incomplete, ignored, or misused data, population data, and particularly data on migrant populations. The second important finding is that budgeting and planning tended to be backward-looking, and I'm going to try and explain that. First of all, based on outdated estimates, using projections from 2001 census data, which are given as standard projections with very little possibility, very little space for municipalities to actually produce their own data, or even if they do so, to have it taken into account into the kind of calculation of resource allocation calculation system. So finally, recommendations. And there are 7 of them. Some of them are quite obvious from what I've said. There is clearly a need to rethink population data collection systems and improve the communication between the different government departments and agencies, particularly between SAGA and Stats SA. Second, the need to mainstream mobility into IDPs and rethink the participatory planning system in such a way that it will give more space to more evidence-based and inclusive, and will be more inclusive of the interest of transient populations and not only of longer-term city residents. Number 3, build a housing ladder. There are a number of implications for that, but essentially the fact that even if this is not strictly speaking a local government mandate, a need to cater for a whole range of accommodation needs, housing needs, which are currently, especially in the secondary cities, and the situation is beginning to be slightly different, for instance, in the city of Johannesburg, do not have the necessary policy instruments to offer that variety of housing. Number 4, to develop budgeting strategies and reform the LGES system. This is a little bit technical, but this was a very clear recommendation from the findings that we came across. Number 6, and the last 2 recommendations are about attitudes. Attitudes and consistency in policy making and monitoring, and particularly monitoring and evaluation. Be consistent when it comes to social cohesion. It's one thing to consider it a priority. It's one thing to have all the policy rhetoric around it. It's a different story to have programs in place in secondary municipalities about it. And to monitor their budgeting and their implementation over time. And this is clearly at the moment not happening. And finally, coming to, strictly speaking, to attitudinal issues, start with your own staff, and this was a key message to Saga. Invest in your own staff and acknowledge the kind of problematic attitudes that we've come across, and try and work on that from education and training programs to staff.